Bredasdorp, South Africa vanished in the Veld. The mysterious disappearance of Anene Booysen, 2013. In the quiet rural town of Bredasdorp, nestled deep in South Africa's Western Cape, a brutal mystery shook the entire nation in early 2013. A case so disturbing it tore through the heart of a community and forced the country to confront its darkest truths. Anene Booysen was a 17-year-old girl, known by her neighbors as shy but warm, someone who carried hope despite a hard life. On the evening of February 1st, 2013, she went out with friends to a local pub. Nothing unusual for a Friday night in a small town. But by dawn, the peace of Bredasdorp was shattered. Anene was found brutally assaulted, mutilated, and left for dead near a construction site on the outskirts of town, a field locals call the Veld. Before she slipped into unconsciousness, she allegedly whispered the name of one of her attackers, Jonathan Davids, a man she once trusted, someone who had worked with her. But the deeper authorities dug, the murkier everything became. Police made quick arrests, but the investigation soon revealed a web of contradictions, missing evidence, inconsistent witness statements, and an unusual rush to close the case. Many in Bredasdorp began to question whether justice was truly being served or if the system was simply looking for an easy answer. Rumors spread like wildfire about multiple perpetrators, about local elites allegedly involved, about police negligence, and about the disturbing patterns of gender-based violence that plagued rural South Africa. As journalists, activists, and investigators arrived in the small town, the story began to transform. Anene's death wasn't just another tragedy. It became a symbol of a country's deep wounds: class division, poverty, gender inequality, and a justice system struggling under its own corruption. But here's the most chilling part. Some locals whispered that what happened to Anene was not random. They claimed she had seen or heard something she wasn't supposed to. Others suggested she was targeted deliberately, that her death was meant to send a message. Over a decade later, despite a conviction, questions remain unanswered. The timeline doesn't fully align. Key witnesses disappeared. Physical evidence was lost, and those who've tried to dig deeper into the case report being silenced or threatened. What really happened that night in Bredasdorp? Who was Anene's true killer or killers? And why does the story feel incomplete, even after all these years? This is the mystery of Vanished in the Veld, a story of truth buried beneath silence, a girl who tried to speak before her final breath, and a community still haunted by what they might never truly know. The girl from Bredasdorp. Bredasdorp, a small, quiet farming town in South Africa's Western Cape. Life moves slowly here. The streets are dusty, the houses simple, and the people live close to the land. It's a place where everyone seems to know everyone. But behind the quiet, poverty and struggle have always shaped daily life. It was here in this small town that a young girl named Anene Booysen grew up. Born in 1995, she was one of many children raised in the hard corners of rural South Africa, a world of limited choices and even fewer chances. Those who knew her said she was shy but kind, the kind of girl who would greet you softly and keep her head down when she spoke. Her life was not easy. Anene's mother died when she was young, and she spent most of her childhood moving between relatives and foster care. By her teenage years, she had already seen more hardship than most adults ever would. Anene found work as a trainee construction worker at a local company, one of the few opportunities available in the town. It was honest work, physically demanding, but it gave her purpose. She was determined to build a better life, to save money, and maybe one day move beyond Bredasdorp's narrow limits. Friends described her as quiet but hopeful, a girl who still believed good things could happen to her. But in a town like Bredasdorp, hope can be fragile. There were few role models, fewer opportunities, and an undercurrent of fear that most young women lived with, a fear of walking home alone at night, a fear of men who used violence as power, a fear of being ignored if something ever happened. Despite all that, Anene was just like any other 17-year-old girl. She liked to laugh, dance, and be with friends. She often went to the Ashton's pub, a small local spot where young people gathered to drink and escape boredom. It was safe enough, or at least that's what everyone believed. She trusted the people around her. She trusted her town, and she had no reason to believe that night would be any different. No one could have known that within a few hours, the girl they saw smiling at the bar would become the center of one of South Africa's most horrific and controversial murder cases. Before February 2013, Anene Booysen was just another name in a quiet town. After February 2013, her name would become a national outcry, a cry for justice, for safety, and for answers that, even now, remain painfully unclear. The night out. It was Friday, February 1st, 2013, a warm evening in Bredasdorp. The kind of night when the small town came alive. Music playing from local bars, people laughing in the streets, and a brief sense of escape from the hard routines of daily life. For Anene Booysen, it was supposed to be a simple night out with friends. After finishing work, she met up with a few people she knew at Ashton's Pub, a small drinking spot near the town center. Everyone there knew each other, workers, locals, young people looking to unwind. It was one of the few places to socialize after dark. Witnesses later recalled seeing Anene laughing and drinking with her friends. She seemed relaxed, happy even. She wasn't drunk, but she had been drinking, enough to feel lighthearted, not enough to seem out of control. Among the people at the pub that night were a few men she knew, including Jonathan Davids, a man who had once worked with her. He was older, known around town, and according to some, had a reputation for being rough but charming. To most, he was just another local face. As the night went on, the crowd thinned. By midnight, only a few people remained at Ashton's Pub. That's when things began to blur. Some said Anene left the bar alone. Others claimed she left with Jonathan and another man. The testimonies never fully aligned. What we know for certain is that around 2 a.m., she was last seen alive, walking along a quiet road that led away from the pub toward the industrial side of Bredasdorp. It was a lonely stretch, dimly lit, surrounded by open felt and half-built construction sites. No one can say for sure what happened next. Did she willingly walk with someone she trusted? Was she followed? Or was she forced off the road and dragged into the darkness? What is known is that hours later, just before dawn, a security guard discovered her, lying near a construction site where she sometimes worked. She was barely alive, badly beaten, and in critical condition. The scene was brutal, the kind of violence that leaves even the most hardened officer shaken. In those first few moments, before she slipped into unconsciousness, Anene allegedly spoke a single name, the name of one of the men from the pub. And with that, the town of Bredasdorp awoke to horror. News spread quickly. People whispered. Parents warned their daughters. The small town that had always felt quiet and safe suddenly felt dangerous and unknown. By sunrise, the police were on the scene. Reporters began to arrive, and a wave of shock and anger began to spread across South Africa. What happened in those lost hours between the pub and the Veld? Who walked with her into the dark? And what really happened before that name was whispered? Those questions would soon drive a nationwide investigation. But for the people of Bredasdorp, the nightmare had only just begun. Found in the Veld, the morning of February 2nd, 2013, began like any other in Bredasdorp. The sun rose over the open fields, lighting the rows of houses and the quiet streets. But near the edge of town, in a patch of rough ground beside an unfinished construction site, something terrible had been found. Just before 6 a.m., a security guard making his usual rounds noticed something unusual, a figure lying motionless on the ground near the gravel path. At first, he thought it was someone passed out after a night of drinking. But as he approached, the reality struck hard. It was Anene Booysen. She was still alive, but barely. Her body was broken, beaten, and mutilated in a way that was almost beyond description. The guard immediately called for help. Police and emergency services arrived soon after, and what they found left even the most experienced officer silent. Anene had been sexually assaulted and violently disemboweled. Her injuries were severe, and the brutality suggested deep rage or deliberate cruelty. Yet somehow, she was still conscious. She couldn't speak clearly, but when a police officer asked who had done this to her, she whispered a single name, Jonathan. It would be her final statement. Anene was rushed to Callan Hospital, but her injuries were too severe. Doctors did everything they could, but she slipped into a coma shortly after arrival and died later that day. She was 17 years old. Back at the scene, investigators worked through the morning. The area was cordoned off, photographs were taken, and evidence markers placed across the dirt. They collected footprints, pieces of torn clothing, and traces of blood. But from the start, the investigation was chaotic and uncoordinated. The Veld was an open area, easily accessible to anyone. People walked through it constantly, workers, children, and curious onlookers who gathered after hearing the news. By the time forensic teams arrived, crucial evidence had already been contaminated. Still, one fact seemed to point in a clear direction: the name she had spoken. By that afternoon, Jonathan Davids, the man she had once worked with and been seen talking to at the pub, was taken into custody. He denied everything. He claimed he had left the bar earlier in the night and had nothing to do with what happened. But the public was already furious. The story spread through radio, television, and newspapers across South Africa. Within hours, Anene's name became known nationwide, not as a girl from small town, but as the victim of one of the most gruesome crimes the country had ever seen. In Bredasdorp, people gathered outside the police station demanding justice. They wanted answers, arrests, punishment, anything that could make sense of what had happened in their quiet town. But what no one yet realized was that this case, the evidence, the investigation, the trial, would soon raise even more questions than it could answer. The Veld where she was found would become a symbol of silence, fear, and doubt, a place that held the truth but refused to give it up easily. The investigation begins. When news of Anene Booysen's assault reached the authorities, Bredasdorp police moved quickly. The brutality of the crime shocked even seasoned officers. But in the rush to find someone to blame, precision was lost in the process. Within hours, detectives declared the case a top priority. The provincial police headquarters sent reinforcements, forensic experts, and media officers. Yet behind the scenes, the investigation was far from orderly. Evidence had been mishandled, the scene contaminated, and the few witnesses available gave conflicting statements. Still, police believed they had a lead. The name Anene had whispered before dying, Jonathan. That led them straight to Jonathan Davids, a 22-year-old man who lived not far from where her body was found. He had a criminal record, mostly petty crimes, and had previously worked on the same construction site as Anene. To the investigators, it seemed like a straightforward link. Davids was arrested within 24 hours of her death. When questioned, he insisted he was innocent. He claimed he had seen Anene at the pub that night, but had left earlier and gone home. There was no physical evidence tying him directly to the crime, but the police were convinced by the dying statement. Soon after, another man was brought in, Morn Harms, a local acquaintance known for getting into fights. Witnesses placed him near the pub that same night, and someone reported seeing him with Anene before she disappeared. He, too, denied involvement. In small towns like Bredasdorp, rumors spread faster than truth. Everyone had a version of what happened. Some said they saw Anene arguing with someone before leaving the bar. Others said she was seen walking alone. One witness even claimed she had returned to the pub briefly after midnight. The timeline began to fracture. Investigators had to rely on partial memories, alcohol-blurred testimonies, and unverified tips. There are no CCTV cameras, no clear forensic links, and no reliable DNA match at the early stage. But the public's anger was growing, and the police needed a suspect. Within days, Morn Harms was released due to lack of evidence. The focus shifted entirely to Jonathan Davids. He became the face of the case, the accused, the man the country wanted answers from. Media outlets published his photo, and talk shows debated his guilt. But quietly, several inconsistencies began to appear. The timeline between the pub and the Veld didn't align with his alibi. The forensic evidence was incomplete and sometimes mislabeled. The dying declaration, the single name she spoke, had no written or recorded verification. It was based on verbal testimony from an officer at the scene. Despite these cracks, the prosecution pressed forward. To the public, the case seemed solved. To the police, closing it quickly meant restoring calm. But not everyone agreed. A few investigative journalists who visited Bredasdorp began to sense that the story didn't add up, that something bigger or darker might be hidden beneath the surface. For now, though, the town believed justice was on the way. The man they thought responsible was in custody, and the name Anene Booysen had become a rallying cry for outrage, for justice, and for change. But the truth was just beginning to unravel. The accused, Jonathan Davids. When police named Jonathan Davids as the prime suspect, his face appeared across newspapers and television screens across South Africa. To the public, he quickly became the villain in one of the country's most horrifying crimes. But who was he, really? Jonathan Davids was 22 years old, born and raised in Bredasdorp. Those who knew him described him as quiet, sometimes short-tempered, but not violent by nature. He had worked as a construction laborer, often on the same site where Anene Booysen was employed. It was there that the two had first met. Co-workers said they often joked around. Some said they were friends. Others whispered that Jonathan had liked her more than she realized. But no one ever suspected that the two would be linked in such a horrifying way. Jonathan lived a few blocks from the pub where Anene spent her last night. He was known to drink there, sometimes alone, sometimes with friends. He didn't have a strong education and had previously served a short sentence for theft. But those who knew him insisted that, while he wasn't perfect, he wasn't capable of something this brutal. When he was arrested, Jonathan told police he was innocent. He said he left the bar around midnight and went straight home. His story remained the same through every interrogation. But the police believed the dying words of the victim were enough. They charged him with rape and murder. The problem was that the case against him was built on thin evidence. There was no DNA match, no eyewitness to the crime itself, and no clear timeline that placed him with Anene after she left the bar. Only her supposed last words, Jonathan, which no one had officially recorded. Jonathan's lawyer argued that there were other men named Jonathan in Bredasdorp, and that the dying declaration could easily have been misheard or misinterpreted. But by then, the media had already decided who the killer was. As the story gained national attention, President Jacob Zuma publicly condemned the attack, calling it inhuman and monstrous. The government promised justice. But that political pressure only added weight to the investigation. The police needed a conviction, fast. Jonathan was held in custody while awaiting trial. Reporters described him as emotionless during court appearances, staring straight ahead, answering softly when asked questions. Some saw this as a sign of guilt. Others saw it as fear, the fear of a poor man trapped in a case too big for him to fight. During pre-trial hearings, whispers began to circulate in Bredasdorp. Whispers that Jonathan wasn't alone that night. Some residents claimed multiple attackers were involved, but the police dismissed the theory, saying there was no evidence to support it. Behind closed doors, community members said there were people with connections and influence who wanted the case closed quickly. They said certain names were never written in the reports, that other suspects were questioned briefly and then released without explanation. But officially, the case was simple. Anene had named Jonathan. He had a record. He had been with her that night. And for the state, that was enough. As the trial approached, the town of Bredasdorp grew divided. Some believed justice was being served. Others quietly believed the wrong man was on trial. What no one yet realized was that, in the months that followed, the courtroom would raise more questions than it could ever answer, and expose how broken the system of justice had truly become. 6. The trial. The trial of Jonathan Davids began in late 2013, almost a year after the murder of Anene Booysen. By then, the case had already captured international attention. Journalists from around the world arrived in Bredasdorp to cover what many called one of the darkest crimes in South Africa's modern history. For the prosecution, the story seemed simple. Anene and Jonathan were seen together at the pub on the night of February 1st. She left the bar shortly after him. Hours later, she was found dying, and before she passed, she spoke his name. It was a direct accusation, or at least that's how the state presented it. The court heard from a police officer who claimed to have heard Anene whisper the name Jonathan at the crime scene. That statement became the cornerstone of the entire case. No written statement existed, no recording, just the officer's word. Then came the forensic evidence, or what little there was. DNA samples collected from the scene were either too damaged or too mixed to give a clear result. There was no blood, hair, or fingerprint linking Jonathan directly to the assault. Even the footprints near the site were inconsistent, several different shoe sizes, overlapping, making it impossible to tell how many people had actually been there. The defense argued that the investigation had been rushed, clumsy, and incomplete. They highlighted how police failed to properly secure the crime scene, how evidence was lost or mislabeled, and how officers appeared more focused on closing the case than finding the truth. But the prosecution leaned heavily on emotion. They spoke of Anene's suffering, her bravery, her final words. They framed Jonathan as a violent man, one who had both motive and opportunity. Witnesses from the pub were called to testify. Some said they saw Jonathan leave with Anene that night. Others said they didn't. A few admitted they weren't sure. It was dark, people were drinking, and memories were unclear. The defense pushed back, questioning every inconsistency, but in a small-town courtroom, under the weight of public anger and political pressure, facts began to blur with feeling. Throughout the trial, Jonathan sat quietly. He rarely spoke, only answering when the judge addressed him. He repeated what he had said since the beginning, that he was innocent, that he left the pub early, and that he had nothing to do with what happened. But the tide of public opinion was already against him. For many, someone had to pay. After weeks of hearings and emotional testimonies, the judge delivered the verdict. Jonathan Davids was found guilty of rape and murder and sentenced to 2 life terms in prison. As the sentence was read, applause broke out in the courtroom. People outside cheered, saying justice had been served. News headlines praised the swift judgment, calling it a victory for women's rights and a warning to would-be offenders. But quietly, a few voices in the back of the room disagreed. They spoke of missing details, of witnesses who had changed their stories, of physical evidence that had never been fully tested, and of something darker, the sense that Jonathan had become the easy answer to a question nobody really wanted to keep asking. For the public, the case was over. For the town of Bredasdorp, the nightmare had an ending. But for those who looked closer, journalists, activists, and a handful of investigators, the trial felt more like the beginning of another mystery. Had justice truly been served? Or had the truth been buried with Anene herself? The town of secrets. After the verdict, Bredasdorp tried to return to normal. The trial was over. The man accused of killing Anene Booysen was behind bars. But in the quiet corners of the town, people whispered. Something about the story didn't sit right. Something about the way it had ended felt unfinished, too clean, too quick. Locals who had followed the investigation closely began to talk in private. They said the police had ignored other suspects, that there were men with influence who were never questioned properly. Some even claimed there had been more than one attacker that night, but those names had been kept out of official reports. In Bredasdorp, gossip can be dangerous. People don't speak openly. They hint, they lower their voices, they say you didn't hear it from me. But as months passed, those whispers became harder to ignore. One rumor spoke of a group of men seen leaving Ashton's pub just after midnight, men who followed Anene down the same road she took home. Another claimed she had been warned days before her death to stay away from certain people involved in illegal dealings near the construction sites. None of these stories made it into the police file. None were confirmed by official sources. But for those who lived there, the pattern felt too familiar. Crimes that went unsolved, victims who were forgotten, and investigations that ended too soon. Journalists who came to Bredasdorp after the trial said they felt a strange silence hanging over the town. People were polite but cautious. When questions were asked about that night, eyes looked away. Some locals believed the police had done their job the best they could. Others believed something or someone was being protected. And then there were the few who believed in something even darker, that Anene's death was not random, that she had stumbled into something she was never meant to see or know. Whatever the truth, the silence around Bredasdorp grew thicker as time went on. The construction site where her body was found was eventually cleared, the ground leveled, and new buildings went up. But even years later, many residents still refused to walk past it at night. To them, the Veld wasn't just a place of death. It was a place that held secrets. Secrets that no one wanted to speak about out loud. Because in small towns like Bredasdorp, everyone knows something. But not everyone can afford to tell the truth. Gender and violence in South Africa. The murder of Anene Booysen didn't just shock Bredasdorp. It shook an entire nation. South Africa had seen violence before, but this case was different. It was personal, brutal, and impossible to ignore. When news broke of how she was found, beaten, mutilated, and left to die, outrage spread across the country. Protests erupted in cities. Politicians made promises. News anchors called it a wake-up call for a nation in crisis. But for many South Africans, it wasn't a wake-up call at all. It was just another reminder of what they already knew, that violence against women in their country was not an exception. It was a pattern. Every day, women across South Africa faced the same fear. Fear of walking home after dark, fear of strangers, fear of the people they knew. Statistically, the country ranked among the highest in the world for rape and gender-based violence. Police records showed that more than 60,000 sexual offenses were reported every year, and experts estimated that for every one that made it to a police station, many more went unreported. In that context, Anene's murder wasn't just a tragedy. It was a symbol of a much deeper problem. Activists took to the streets, holding signs that read, "Enough is enough. Justice for Anene. Stop the war on women." Her name became a rallying cry. Schools held vigils. Churches held prayers. Even international human rights groups spoke out, calling for stronger protections for women and accountability within the justice system. But as the weeks passed, anger slowly turned into frustration. Despite the outcry, little changed. The same stories continued. Women assaulted, cases dismissed, families left without answers. For many, it began to feel like the system itself was broken. A system that punished the poor and ignored the powerless, especially when the victims were young, female, and from rural communities like Bredasdorp. Sociologists pointed out how poverty, unemployment, and alcohol abuse fueled this cycle of violence. They spoke of how generations grew up normalizing it, how young men were never taught empathy, and how women were often blamed instead of protected. And through all of this, Anene's face remained a reminder of how far South Africa still had to go. Her case sparked national debates in Parliament. It inspired campaigns, documentaries, and public discussions about consent, policing, and gender rights. But behind the speeches and headlines, people in her town still whispered the same questions. Had justice truly been done? Or had her death been used to make the country feel like it had acted, when, in truth, nothing had really changed? In the end, her story became both a tragedy and a warning, a symbol of the pain so many carried and the silence that too often followed. And though the government called for reforms and promised better systems for the women of South Africa, especially in towns like Bredasdorp, the fear never really went away. Because Anene's story wasn't just hers. It was the story of 1,000 others, whose names the world would never hear. What the media missed. When Anene Booysen's story broke in February 2013, the media coverage was immediate, intense, and emotional. News outlets across South Africa and even internationally reported on the horrific details: the assault, the mutilation, and the accused, Jonathan Davids. But in the rush to cover the story, many critical details were overlooked. Journalists on the ground later reported inconsistencies in the initial police statements. The timeline of the evening, from the pub to the Veld, never fully aligned with witness testimonies. Some witnesses who claimed to see Anene with Jonathan could not confidently identify him under cross-examination. Others changed their statements after speaking with the police. There were also gaps in the forensic evidence. Some reports suggested that blood samples and clothing fragments were lost or contaminated, while other forensic documents were incomplete or misfiled. One of the most significant issues was the dying declaration. the name Anene allegedly whispered before she passed away. It was reported by a single officer, verbally, with no recording or written confirmation at the scene. Yet, this statement became the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. Investigative journalists who revisited the town years later uncovered quiet whispers among locals. Some claimed they had seen multiple men near the site that night, men who were never questioned thoroughly. Others said there were people with influence who wanted the case closed quickly, leaving critical leads unexplored. A few witnesses who spoke out publicly later said they were intimidated into silence, or their testimonies were dismissed. The media also largely ignored these complexities, focusing instead on the shock and horror of the crime. Graphic details sold headlines, but the systemic flaws, contradictions, and unanswered questions rarely made it to the front pages. Some investigative outlets tried to dig deeper, but their reports often faded in the glare of public outrage. The narrative was simple. A young girl was murdered, the accused was in custody, justice had been served. Yet, for those who looked closer, the story was far from complete. The evidence didn't tell the full story. Witnesses were unreliable or afraid. The town itself seemed to guard secrets that were never reported, leaving cracks in the official version. By the time the trial ended, the media coverage had largely moved on. The country's attention shifted to the next tragedy, the next outrage, leaving behind a trail of questions that remained unanswered. And in those gaps, the truth, or what some believe might have been the truth, continued to linger, hidden in the shadows of a small town, waiting for someone bold enough to ask the right questions. The unanswered questions. Even years after the trial and conviction of Jonathan Davids, the murder of Anene Booysen continues to raise difficult questions, questions that were never fully answered and may never be. First, there is the timeline of events. Witnesses at the pub gave conflicting accounts of when Anene left, who she was with, and whether she was seen alone or with other men. Security footage from that night was either missing or non-existent, leaving investigators with only partial, unreliable testimonies. Then there is the dying declaration, the single name Anene reportedly whispered before she passed. No recording was made, and the officer who testified was the only person to report it. Critics have questioned how much weight should be given to a verbal statement made under extreme trauma, especially without independent verification. Forensic evidence also leaves unanswered questions. The crime scene was contaminated almost immediately. Footprints and clothing fragments were mixed or lost, and no DNA definitively linked Jonathan to the crime. Some experts argue that the investigation relied too heavily on circumstantial evidence, rather than concrete proof. Locals have whispered of other potential suspects, men who were seen near the construction site, some with past criminal records, some with connections in the town. These individuals were either released without explanation or never questioned thoroughly. Why? Was it oversight, negligence, or something more deliberate? Then there are the political and social pressures. The case became a national symbol of gender-based violence. Authorities faced intense scrutiny, and media coverage was relentless. Some suggest that in the rush to satisfy public outrage, the investigation was steered toward a single suspect, convenient, visible, and accountable, rather than a full exploration of all possibilities. Even the trial itself leaves questions. The evidence presented was incomplete. Witnesses changed their stories. And while Jonathan was convicted, many argue that the courtroom never explored alternative theories that could have involved multiple attackers or hidden motives. Finally, the community itself seems to guard its secrets. Residents of Bredasdorp speak cautiously, quietly hinting at knowledge they will not put into public record. Stories of threats, intimidation, and fear linger, making it clear that some truths remain buried in the town, just as Anene's body was found in the Veld, exposed to the world, yet concealed in its full reality. These unanswered questions do not only haunt the memory of Anene Booysen. They haunt the justice system, the community, and anyone who seeks to understand the full story. Because even after conviction, even after trials and headlines, the truth remains elusive. And in small towns like Bredasdorp, The truth is often the hardest thing to uncover. Silence in the Veld. Years have passed since the tragic death of Anene Booysen, but the Veld where she was found continues to hold a weight that cannot be erased. For the people of Bredasdorp, it is more than a patch of open land. It is a reminder, a silent witness to a night that changed lives forever. The construction site where she was discovered has long been cleared and replaced by new buildings. Yet, those who lived nearby remember. Some refuse to walk that way at night. Some lower their voices when the topic comes up. The fear, the suspicion, and the unanswered questions have not faded. Locals describe the town as quiet but tense. Daily life continues, but shadows linger. Conversations about that night are careful, fragmented, and cautious. Many still believe that not all the facts have been told, that some details were deliberately kept from the public. For those who knew Anene personally, her death left a void impossible to fill. Family, friends, and neighbors are haunted not only by the memory of her suffering, but also by the sense that the system failed her. Justice was served in court, yes, but the full truth of what happened in the Veld that night remains hidden, incomplete, and deeply troubling. Her story has become a lesson, a warning, and a symbol. It reminds communities everywhere of the fragility of safety, the pervasive threat of gender-based violence, and the importance of accountability in law enforcement and the justice system. Journalists and activists who have revisited Bredasdorp describe a town still grappling with fear and silence. The locals are polite, guarded, and wary. Many express sorrow and empathy for Anene, but few dare to speak openly about what they know or think they know. In the Veld, time has passed, but silence has settled like dust over the fields. It is a silence that contains grief, secrets, and unanswered questions. A silence that speaks louder than words, louder than headlines, louder than courtroom verdicts. And as long as that silence remains, so too does the memory of Anene Booysen, a girl who trusted her town, a girl whose life ended in violence, and a story that continues to echo in the hearts of a nation. The Veld remembers. The town remembers. And in that remembrance, Anene's story continues, a quiet, haunting call for truth, justice, and change. The echo of a name. The story of Anene Booysen is more than the account of one tragic night. It is a reflection of a society grappling with violence, injustice, and silence. In the quiet fields of Bredasdorp, where she was found, the echoes of that night remain. The crime scene has long been cleared, the trial concluded, and a man convicted. Yet the questions linger about what really happened, about who knew more than they admitted, and about whether justice, in its fullest sense, was ever truly served. Anene's life was short, but her story has endured. It has become a symbol of courage, pain, and the urgent need for change. A reminder that behind every statistic, every headline, every courtroom, there are real people, families, communities, and victims whose voices must be heard. For those who lived in Bredasdorp, the memory is a constant shadow, a reminder that evil can touch even the quietest places. And for the world, Anene's story is a call to action, to speak out, to question, to seek justice, and to never forget. Her name lives on, whispered, remembered, and carried forward, a haunting echo in the Veld, a plea for truth, and a testament to the resilience of those who refuse to let silence win. Anene Booysen's story is a warning, a memory, and a challenge. To confront violence, to demand accountability, and to ensure that no other life is lost without the world listening. The Veld is quiet now, but silence speaks.